4:57 p.m. The Riverside Park was bustling. Mark, a 39-year-old single dad, sat on a wooden bench with his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. They were sharing ice cream, watching boats drift by. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. At the nearby wooden pier, a woman slipped on the rain-slicked planks and tumbled into the freezing river. The crowd froze, paralyzed by the current's speed. Lily gripped Mark's hand, her eyes wide with terror. "Dad, save her!" she pleaded. Without a second thought, Mark stripped off his jacket, tossed his phone, and plunged into the icy depths. The park held its breath. To understand why Mark jumped, you have to understand the 5 years that led up to this moment. Mark wasn't a hero by trade. He spent his days climbing utility poles and crawling into cramped substations to ensure the city had light. It was a thankless, invisible job. He was a man of routines. Every morning at 6 a.m., he'd wake up, pack Lily's lunch, braid her hair, a skill that took him 3 years to master, and drop her at school. Since his wife, Sarah, passed away from a sudden illness 5 years ago, Mark had lived in a state of quiet survival. He had closed himself off from the world, focusing entirely on the small, bright sun that was his daughter. He wasn't a marathon runner. He wasn't a lifeguard. He was just a guy who tried to stay under the radar. But he had one thing most people in that park didn't: situational awareness. His job required it. In the field, a mistake meant a lethal shock. He was trained to stay calm when things sparked. He was trained to look for the safest path. And he knew how to swim, not for sport, but because his father had insisted on it, growing up near the coast. On this particular afternoon, Mark had finished a grueling shift early. A transformer had blown 3 blocks away, and he'd managed to bypass the circuit in record time. His reward was a few extra hours with Lily. They had been talking about her math test. "I got an A, Dad," she had said, swinging her legs. "But I had to help Sarah, the other Sarah, with the long division. She was crying because she didn't get it." Mark had smiled, ruffling her hair. "That's my girl. You always help people." "Just like you," she replied. "I only help when I can, kiddo," he'd said modestly. "Most of the time, I just turn the lights back on." But as they sat there, the woman in the pink top had caught his eye. She was about 32, focused, her breathing rhythmic as she jogged along the riverbank. She looked strong, capable, but the river didn't care about strength. The wooden bridge she was crossing was an old structure, part of the city's historical charm, but a nightmare for maintenance. The wood absorbed water, and after the light rain, it turned into a skating rink. When she slipped, it wasn't a graceful fall. Her head hit the railing before she hit the water. Mark saw it. He saw the way her body went limp for a second before the current took her. The river looked calm from a distance, but Mark knew better. This was the tidal section. The water was moving fast, pulled by the invisible hand of the ocean miles away. It was deep enough to drown a person, but more importantly, it was cold. Cold enough to steal the breath from your lungs in seconds. As he stood on the bank, watching the crowd freeze in a collective paralysis of "someone else will do it," Mark felt a familiar spark in his chest. It was the same feeling he got when he saw a downed line hissing on a sidewalk, a sense of duty that bypassed the brain's self-preservation center. Lily's voice was the final push. "Save her!" It wasn't a request. It was a command from the person he loved most. If he stayed on the bank, he wouldn't just be letting a woman drown. He would be letting his daughter's image of him die too. To stretch the narrative, we must look into the quiet moments of that afternoon. Mark remembered the way the light hit the water, a deceptively peaceful shimmer that hid the deadly cold beneath. He thought of the times Sarah had told him he was too cautious, too focused on the what-ifs. But today, the what-if had become a now. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on the back of his neck, a heavy weight of expectation and fear. He could feel the frantic energy of the park shifting from leisure to emergency. Every second he waited was a second the woman drifted further toward the dark heart of the river. His technician's mind calculated the distance, the angle of the current, and the physical toll the cold would take on a body that wasn't prepared for it. He knew he wasn't in peak condition, but he knew he was the only one with the specific set of skills and the proximity to make a difference. The world seemed to narrow down to just 3 points: him, his daughter, and the woman in the water. The moment Mark's body hit the water, the world changed. The temperature was a physical blow. It felt like being slammed into a wall of needles. The river was barely 50 degrees. His muscles instantly tightened, a biological reaction called the cold shock response. His lungs gasped for air that wasn't there. But he fought it. Focus, Mark. Breathe. Get your head up. He broke the surface, gasping. The current was already trying to sweep him downstream. He looked toward the pier. The woman, let's call her Elena, was bobbing about 15 feet away. She was awake now, but she was in the throes of total, blind panic. She was splashing violently, her arms hitting the water with no rhythm. This was the most dangerous phase of a drowning. In the instinctive drowning response, a person cannot call for help. Their mouth sinks below the surface, pops up just long enough to gasp, and sinks again. Their arms move laterally, trying to climb the water. Mark began to swim. He wasn't fast, but he was steady. Each stroke felt like he was pulling through thick syrup. His heavy denim jeans were soaking up water, acting like anchors on his legs. Back on the shore, the scene was surreal. 100 people were watching. Some were filming on their iPhones. The vertical glow of their screens, a pale imitation of the drama unfolding in front of them. Someone was shouting into a phone, giving the 911 operator the wrong location. "He's going to drown too!" A woman on the bank cried out. "Look at the current," another shouted. They weren't bad people. They were just humans. They saw the danger, and their lizard brains told them to stay on land. They saw the river as a monster. They saw the cold as a death sentence. But Lily didn't see any of that. She was standing at the very edge of the grass, her small boots inches from the mud. She was silent now. Her hands were clenched into tiny fists at her sides. She was watching her father's head disappear and reappear among the ripples. Mark reached Elena within 30 seconds, but it felt like 30 minutes. As he got closer, he saw her eyes. They were wide, the whites showing all around the iris. She didn't see a savior. She saw a floating object to climb on. If he swam directly into her arms, she would grab him. She would push him under to keep herself up. It was a reflex. 2 people would drown today instead of 1. Mark stopped about 3 feet away. "Stop!" he roared, his voice cracking from the cold. "Elena, look at me! Stop fighting!" He didn't know her name, but he used a firm, authoritative tone he usually reserved for apprentices on a dangerous job site. She didn't stop. She lunged for him. Mark ducked. He dove under the surface, feeling the dark, murky water close over his head. He swam behind her. This was the technique he'd learned years ago. You don't face a drowning victim. You approach from the rear. He surfaced behind her and reached out. He grabbed her under the armpits, pulling her back against his chest. "I've got you," he hissed into her ear, his teeth beginning to chatter. "I've got you. Lean back. Look at the sky. Just look at the sky." The weight was immense. Elena was a small woman, but with wet clothes and the drag of the river, she felt like lead. The current had pulled them nearly 50 yards from the pier. They were moving toward the center of the river. "Help!" Elena finally managed to choke out. "Don't talk," Mark commanded. "Save your air. I'm not letting go." In that moment, Mark wasn't thinking about the 4:57 p.m. peace he had felt minutes ago. He wasn't thinking about his mortgage or his sore lower back. He was a machine built to hold on. He kicked with everything he had. His legs burned. The cold was moving from his skin into his bones. His fingers were becoming numb, losing their grip on her jacket. He looked toward the shore. He saw the blur of the crowd. He saw the bright yellow of the ice cream stand. And then he saw the small, unmoving dot of his daughter. "I have to get back to the bench," he thought. "I have to finish my ice cream." It was a ridiculous thought, but it was the only thing that kept his heart beating against the freezing tide. The water was a living thing, a cold, indifferent force that wanted to pull them into the depths. Every time a wave splashed over them, Mark felt a surge of pure, primal fear. But he also felt a strange clarity. He noticed the way the sunlight refracted through the bubbles, the way the sound of the world was muffled and distorted by the water. He could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic, thudding rhythm in his ears. He focused on the sensation of Elena's weight, making sure he didn't slip his grip. He knew that if he let go for even a second, the current would carry her away, and she would be lost in the vast gray expanse of the river. He forced himself to keep moving, to keep kicking, even when his muscles screamed in protest. He was no longer a man. He was a desperate link between life and death. The struggle in the water was a silent war. While the crowd on the bank was noisy, crying, shouting, filming, the actual rescue was quiet. It was the sound of heavy breathing and the rhythmic slap of water against skin. Mark realized they weren't making progress toward the bank. The current was too strong. If he kept trying to swim straight back, he would exhaust himself and they would both drift into the shipping channel where the big barges moved. He had to swim diagonally. He had to use the current, not fight it. "We're going downriver!" Elena panicked, feeling the shore slip away. "Trust me," Mark gasped. His vision was starting to tunnel. The early signs of hypothermia were setting in. His brain was getting sluggish. "Trust me." He changed his angle. He aimed for a small outcrop of rocks further down the bank, where the water slowed in an eddy. Every kick was a battle. Every breath was a victory. On the shore, a few men finally snapped out of their trance. One man wearing a business suit threw off his tie and ran down to the muddy edge. Another teenager followed. They didn't jump in. They weren't as brave or perhaps not as foolish as Mark, but they were ready. The teenager found a long branch. The businessman took off his leather belt and looped it with another person's scarf. "Over here!" they shouted. Mark saw them, but they were still 20 feet away. 20 feet might as well have been 20 miles. His left leg cramped. A sharp, searing pain shot up his calf. He let out a muffled groan, his head dipping below the surface for a second. He swallowed a mouthful of the oily, cold river water. He coughed, choking, but he didn't release his grip on the woman. "Dad!" Lily's voice reached him across the water. It was high-pitched, piercing the wind. It acted like a jolt of electricity. Mark found a hidden reserve of strength. He didn't know where it came from. Maybe it was the adrenaline of a father. Maybe it was the stubbornness of a man who refused to let his daughter be an orphan. He kicked, he lunged. His hands scraped against something hard. A rock. He grabbed it, his fingernails tearing against the rough surface. The current tried to rip him away, but he anchored himself. "Grab the branch," the teenager screamed. Mark looked up. A sturdy oak branch was hovering over the water. He reached out with one hand, still holding Elena with the other. He missed. "Again!" The teenager leaned out further, his own feet slipping in the mud. This time, Mark caught it. He gripped the rough bark like it was the hand of God. Slowly, agonizingly, the people on the shore began to pull. They acted like a human chain. The businessman grabbed the teenager's waist. A woman grabbed the businessman. They hauled them in. The moment Mark's knees hit the mud, his strength vanished. He collapsed into the shallow water, still holding Elena's arm. Hands reached down. Dozens of hands. They pulled Elena up first. She was shivering violently, her face a ghostly shade of blue, but she was breathing. Then they reached for Mark. He didn't move for a long time. He just lay there in the mud, his chest heaving, his eyes closed. He felt the warmth of the air. Air that had felt cool minutes ago now felt like a blanket. And then he felt the weight of a small body slamming into him. Lily didn't care about the mud. She didn't care that he was soaking wet and smelled of river silt. She threw her arms around his neck and sobbed into his shoulder. "You did it," she wailed. "You saved her, Dad." Mark wrapped his trembling arms around her. He couldn't speak. His jaw was locked tight from the cold, but he held her. Nearby, a woman draped a dry coat over his shoulders. A man handed him a thermos of coffee. The crowd that had been silent and paralyzed was now a hive of activity. They were heroes now, in the aftermath. They were the support crew. The sirens of the ambulance finally wailed in the distance. The paramedics arrived 4 minutes too late for the action, but just in time for the recovery. As they loaded Elena onto a stretcher, she looked over at Mark. Her eyes were no longer wide with panic. They were filled with an overwhelming, silent gratitude. She tried to say something, but the oxygen mask was already over her face. Mark just gave a small, tired nod. He sat on the grass. Lily tucked under his arm and watched the emergency lights flicker against the darkening sky. The ice cream was gone. The sun had set, but they were both still there. To add more detail, the rescue operation was a masterclass in community coordination that happened in a flash. Mark noticed how the light changed from gold to a deep bruising purple as he fought for every inch of progress. He could feel the texture of the mud between his toes, the slickness of the river grass, and the sharp bite of the wind as it caught his wet skin. He was aware of the murmurs of the crowd, a low hum of anxiety and awe that followed his every move. He saw the teenager's face, pale and determined, and the businessman's sweat-streaked forehead as they strained to pull him in. These details burned into his mind, creating a vivid tapestry of a moment that had felt like an eternity. He felt the shift in Elena's breathing as she realized they were safe, a long, shuddering exhale that seemed to deflate her entire body. He felt the heat of Lily's tears on his neck, a warm contrast to the icy river water. The walk back to the truck was slow. Mark was wrapped in 2 blankets provided by the EMTs. His clothes were in a plastic bag. He was wearing a pair of oversized hospital scrubs they had given him to stay warm. He looked ridiculous, but he didn't care. Lily walked beside him, holding his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. Every few steps, she would look up at him, as if checking to make sure he wasn't going to vanish. "Your phone is broken, Dad," she said quietly, holding up the device he'd left on the bench. It was fine, actually, but the screen was cracked from when he'd tossed it. "It's okay," Mark rasped. His voice was finally coming back. "It's just a phone. And you lost your shoes." Mark looked down at his feet. He was wearing the thin blue socks from the ambulance. He'd kicked his work boots off before jumping, but one had fallen into the river during the commotion. "The river needed them more than I did," he joked weakly. They reached his old Ford F-150. He climbed in and cranked the heat to the maximum. The vents hissed, blowing warm air over his frozen skin. He watched his hands. They were still shaking. Not from the cold anymore, but from the realization of what had just happened. He could have died. He could have left Lily alone in that park. The thought made his stomach flip. "Dad?" Lily asked from the passenger seat. "Yeah, honey. Were you scared?" Mark looked at her. He could have lied. He could have played the tough guy, the invincible father. But he looked at the way she was watching him, learning from him. "Yes," he said honestly. "I was terrified. The water was so cold, Lily, and it was so strong." She frowned, her little brow furrowing. "Then why did you jump? If you were scared, why didn't you wait for the police?" Mark leaned back against the headrest. He thought about the 5 years of being a single father, the nights he'd sat in the kitchen, wondering if he was doing enough, the moments he'd felt invisible to the world. "Because," he said softly, "sometimes helping matters more than being afraid. Sometimes if you don't move, no one will. And I couldn't let you see me just stand there." Lily nodded solemnly. She seemed to process this. "You're a hero, Dad, like in the movies." "No," Mark said, starting the engine. "I'm just a guy who knows how to swim. Now let's go home. I think we've had enough park for one day." By the time they got home, the video was already online. One of the people in the crowd, a teenager with a popular TikTok account, had captured the whole thing. The jump, the struggle, the human chain. But the part that made the video go viral wasn't the rescue itself. It was the audio. The video started with the sound of Lily's voice. "Dad, save her!" And then it showed the man in the work clothes, without a second of hesitation, leaping into the gray abyss. The internet called him the Pier Dad. By the next morning, the video had 5 million views. People were commenting from all over the world. "This is what a real man looks like. The way he didn't even think. That's pure instinct. Listen to the daughter. She knew her dad would do it." Reporters called the electric company. They knocked on his door. But Mark didn't answer. He didn't want the fame. He didn't want the hero label. He just wanted to go back to work. He spent the next few days in a haze of normalcy. He fixed a downed line on 4th Street. He bought Lily new school shoes. He finally bought himself a new pair of work boots. But things were different. When he walked Lily to the bus stop, the other parents didn't just nod. They smiled. They looked at him with a new kind of respect. He wasn't just the quiet widower anymore. He was the man who jumped. He found himself thinking about the water at night, the way it felt like it was trying to swallow him whole. He remembered the silence of the depths, the weight of the woman's body, and the sheer desperation of the moment. He realized that he had been living in a kind of shadow for 5 years, mourning his wife and focusing only on the small, safe world he had built for Lily. This event had cracked that world open, forcing him to engage with the larger world again. He saw the kindness of strangers, the power of a collective effort, and the importance of being present in the moment. He realized that his life had value beyond just being a father and a worker. He was a part of a community, a man capable of extraordinary things when called upon. Exactly 1 week later, there was a knock on the door. Mark was in the middle of helping Lily with a science project, a papier-mâché volcano that was currently getting more flour paste on the floor than on the cardboard. He opened the door and froze. Standing on his porch was a woman. She was dressed in a simple sundress, her hair pulled back. She looked healthy, though there was a small fading bruise on her temple. It was Elena. Beside her was a man, presumably her husband, and a small boy about Lily's age. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said. Her voice was steady now, but her eyes were shimmering with emotion. "I had to find you. The hospital wouldn't give me your name. But, well, you're famous on the internet." Mark rubbed the back of his neck, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "You didn't have to come here." "I did," she insisted. She stepped forward and handed him a basket. It was filled with gourmet coffee, chocolates, and a handwritten card. "You saved my life. I don't remember much after I hit the water, but I remember your voice. You told me to look at the sky." She looked down at her son. "Because of you, this little boy still has a mother. There are no words for that, Mark." Mark looked at the boy. He saw the same look in the boy's eyes that he saw in Lily's, a look of total, uncomplicated love for a parent. "Anyone would have done it," Mark said, the old reflex of modesty kicking in. Elena's husband stepped forward and shook Mark's hand. His grip was firm. "Actually, they didn't. We saw the video. 100 people watched. You were the only one who moved." Lily came running to the door then, her hands covered in white paste. "Dad, who is it?" Elena knelt down so she was at Lily's eye level. "Is this the girl who told her dad to save me?" Lily nodded shyly. "Thank you," Elena whispered. "You are a very brave girl for sharing your dad with me for a few minutes." They stayed for an hour. They drank tea. The kids played in the backyard. It was a strange, beautiful afternoon. Two families brought together by a slip of wood and a moment of courage. When they left, the house felt quieter. Mark sat on the porch swing with Lily as the sun began to set, just like it had a week ago. "Dad." "Yeah, Lily." "Are we going back to the park tomorrow?" Mark looked at the horizon. He thought about the river. He thought about the cold. He thought about the fear. "Yeah," he said. "We're going back. We'll sit on our bench. We'll eat our ice cream. And if someone falls in?" Mark pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Then we'll call for help. And if help doesn't come, we'll do what we have to do." Lily leaned her head against his chest. "You're my hero, Dad." Mark watched the first stars begin to poke through the purple sky. He wasn't a technician right now. He wasn't a widower. He wasn't a viral sensation. "No, kiddo," he whispered. "I'm just your dad." But as the wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the oak trees, Mark knew the truth. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. They don't have capes or superpowers. Sometimes they're just fathers sitting on a park bench, holding a melting ice cream cone, waiting for the moment the world needs them to be more than they ever thought they could be. The world is full of people waiting for a hero, but on a Tuesday at 4:57 p.m., a little girl didn't have to wait, because her hero was already holding her hand. Sometimes a jump is just a jump, but sometimes it's a bridge between a life lost and a life found. Mark closed his eyes and breathed in the cool evening air. He was tired. His back ached. He had work at 6 a.m., but for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt alive. And as Lily fell asleep against his shoulder, He knew that the river hadn't just changed the woman in the pink top, it had washed away the shadows of his own heart. He was a father. He was a savior. He was whole. And that was enough. That was more than enough. He looked at the science project, the flower paste drying on his hands, and he felt a deep sense of peace. He realized that life was a series of moments, some small and quiet, some loud and terrifying, and that the only thing that mattered was how you showed up for them. He was ready for whatever came next, not because he was a hero, but because he was a man who had found his way back to the light. He knew that the memory of that day would stay with him forever, a constant reminder of the strength he didn't know he had, and the love that made it all possible. He was Mark, a maintenance technician, a single dad, and a man who had jumped without hesitation. And in the grand scheme of things, that was the most important role he would ever play. Sometimes heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they're just fathers sitting on a park bench until someone needs help.